There's this company from the Netherlands. It's nearly 4 centuries old and its value was just absurd. Picture this. Imagine you took Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Saudi Aramco, added up their entire market values, and still didn't reach the valuation of this one Dutch enterprise. Seriously, when we talk about capitalism, dynasties and old generational wealth, we usually think of names like the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds. That's just what comes to mind first. But hardly anyone stops to think about this discrete Dutch powerhouse that changed the game entirely. This company didn't just break the mold, it invented the mold. They launched the first modern corporation, built the first stock exchange, and pioneered the very first initial public offering. And get this, the company still technically exists today. So stay with me. Today, we're diving into one of the strangest and most powerful stories in financial history, the Dutch East India Company, and its connection to a royal house that quietly shaped the modern world, the House of Orange. To really understand how this all began, we have to rewind time. It's 1580, and something major just happened on the Iberian Peninsula. Spain, already a global empire, had just absorbed Portugal in what they called a personal union. Now think about that. 2 world powers suddenly merged under one royal crown. Overnight, Spain gained access to Portugal's global territories. Together, they now controlled enormous regions in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. This one move flipped the balance of maritime power completely. And for the Dutch, this wasn't just political news. It was an existential threat. See, even though they were technically under Spanish rule at the time, the Dutch were already deep in a war for their independence. And now, with Portugal's resources backing Spain, the challenge just became 10 times harder. Spain was looking unstoppable, but the Dutch knew something. They didn't need to match firepower for firepower. Instead, they built a different kind of weapon, not with cannons, with capital. In the year 1602, 7 private trading firms came together and merged into a single force. That force became something the world had never seen before. Now, I won't even attempt to pronounce its original Dutch name, you'll see it on screen, but most people today just call it the VOC, or more commonly, the Dutch East India Company. It got the name Dutch East India Company for a simple reason. They were Dutch, of course, and most of their operations revolved around the East Indies. Back then, that term referred broadly to the islands of modern-day Indonesia, Malaysia, and nearby regions. At first glance, you might think, okay, another merchant company, right? Just more traders sailing around. But that couldn't be further from the truth. Beneath the surface, this thing wasn't just a trading outfit. It was a machine designed for economic warfare. The VOC wasn't just shipping goods. It had armed vessels, its own military forces, and fortified posts spread across strategic points around the world. But here's what really set it apart. The most groundbreaking feature wasn't the ships or the guns, it was the way the company was owned. For the first time in history, everyday citizens in the Netherlands could put their money into imperial expansion, and actually profit from it. Instead of kings funding wars and conquest through taxes, the VOC opened the door for regular people to buy in. They created a model where wealth didn't come from inherited titles or land. It came from investing in global trade. It came from market. This company didn't just operate within a kingdom. It grew like no kingdom ever had, all without a crown, and without a single coin collected in tax. Now the merchants ran the daily operations. They built the strategies, but holding up the foundation, the structure that kept this beast standing, that came from someone else entirely, someone watching from above. Throughout the Republic, one powerful family was paying close attention to all of this. A family with history, ambition, and a whole lot at stake. That family was the House of Orange. Now, when I say House of Orange, you might be picturing something totally different. No, not those guys. I'm talking about this House of Orange, one of the most prominent noble families of the era. But here's the thing. They didn't actually rule over any kingdom. They weren't monarchs. Not in the traditional sense. In fact, in the new merchant-led republic, their noble titles didn't carry much political weight. The old systems were fading, and in this rising order of commerce and capital, the House of Orange found itself cornered. On one side, Amsterdam's powerful merchant elite were demanding stronger control under a republican model. On the other side, Spain, still furious about Dutch rebellion. wanted to wipe out the dynasty entirely. And unlike other noble houses, the Oranges didn't have land to fall back on. They didn't have peasant labor or gold mines to keep them afloat. So they faced a stark choice: fade into history or adapt. They chose to adapt. No longer able to rely on inherited wealth or royal authority, they used what they still had: access to capital, connections, leverage. Now, to be clear, the House of Orange didn't run the Dutch East India Company directly, but they didn't need to. What they did instead was tie their fate to it. They invested in it, protected it, and backed it when it mattered. And in return, the company became part of their long-term strategy for influence and survival. This wasn't just symbolic. Their involvement gave them real leverage. In a society where titles no longer guaranteed power, ownership and investment became the new path to influence. And over time, that connection between family and company only deepened. Eventually, it became official. Two figures from the House of Orange would rise to become key figures, not just in politics, but inside the structure of this global trading empire. They weren't crowned kings, but they were presidents. Presidents of a company so powerful, it could reshape continents. And their names? William I and William IV. So, let's talk about these two figures. William I and William III. They held the title of stadtholder, which was basically the highest-ranking public office in the Dutch Republic at the time. Think of it like a blend of head of state, military leader, and national steward. Both of them were direct descendants of the House of Orange, and both ended up serving as the presidents of not just the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, but also its counterpart, the Dutch West India Company. Now, while the VOC was trading and expanding across Asia, the West India Company was focused on the other side of the map, the Americas. That meant trade with the West Indies, which included sugar, tobacco, slaves, and other commodities. Together, these two companies were effectively global arms of Dutch imperial trade. With William I and V in those leadership roles, the House of Orange now stood at the crossroads of business and state. These weren't just noblemen anymore. They were power brokers, operating at the highest level of global commerce. As the VOC expanded east, the family's influence rose right along with it. They weren't wearing crowns. No, but they didn't need to. Their wealth didn't come from royal taxes. It came from dividends. And those dividends came from a company that moved like no other. See, the VOC wasn't behaving like a business. It moved like a state with sales. When your market value exceeds the GDP of entire countries, when your ships have private armies on board, when you capture territories and build your own fortresses, you're no longer just a company. You're a sovereign power, plain and simple. At its peak, the Dutch East India Company was worth more than $7.9 trillion. Adjusted to today's value. That's not a typo. Just to compare, the most valuable company today, Nvidia, is sitting at about half that. That's how massive the VOC became. It didn't just sail with cargo, it carried the weight of an empire. One built not by a crown, but by shares. During the golden age of the VOC, roughly from the early 1600s to the mid-1700s, over 1 million people left the Netherlands, heading straight for Asia. They boarded massive fleets of East Indiamen. Those were the VOC's iconic cargo ships, instantly recognizable and packed with ambition. But these weren't just curious travelers or settlers looking for new opportunities. These were employees, workers, pieces of a massive corporate engine. The VOC hired everyone it needed: sailors, clerks, craftsmen, soldiers. Each one had a role in building and maintaining the company's global trade empire. And they weren't just moving goods. They were building infrastructure, running ports, protecting warehouses, negotiating with rulers, enforcing Dutch interests, and when necessary, doing it with force. It's easy to focus on the VOC's size, its ships, its wealth, but behind all of that was a human system, hundreds of thousands of lives tied to this single company's rise. It was, in every sense, an empire made of contracts and cargo. But none of this, not the scale, not the speed, not the spread, could have happened in a vacuum. Because the VOC's success wasn't built on ambition alone. It stood on three powerful pillars: a state-backed charter, a financial elite in Amsterdam, and the strategic support of the House of Orange. That charter, it was no simple business license. It functioned more like a royal decree, Only it wasn't from a king. It gave the company exclusive control over Dutch trade with Asia. But it didn't stop there. The charter allowed the VOC to sign international treaties, raise armies, seize territories, and even govern colonies. Every decision carried the weight of a sovereign flag, but the authority came from a company's boardroom. With close to 150 merchant ships, a workforce of about 50,000, and its own private military force numbering around 10,000 soldiers, the VOC didn't act like it was on the sidelines. It moved like a state, with sails. And its presence left a mark on every region it touched, from the Persian Gulf to Japan. Nowhere was the VOC's power felt more than in the East Indies, the very heart of its ambition. In 1610, the company secured permission to build a small post near the Siliwangi River. Just 9 years later, in 1619, they captured a key port city, what we now know as Jakarta, and renamed it Batavia, after the ancient name for the Netherlands. But this wasn't just a rebranding. Batavia became the beating heart of Dutch operations in Asia. It was more than a trading base. It was a full-blown capital, a command center, and a symbol of control. And that legacy still lingers today. From architecture to food, from language to law, you can still trace Dutch fingerprints across Indonesia. Batavia wasn't just where trade happened, it was where orders were given. For 300 years, Dutch governors ruled from there, and the surrounding kingdoms, islands, and chiefdoms all reported back to VOC interests. But scaling something this large didn't just require ships and men, it needed serious funding. And the VOC found a solution that no empire had tried before. Rather than depending on kings, or on short-term loans from banks, they turned to something completely new: the public, regular citizens, investors. In August of 1602, the VOC opened its doors to the public. For the first time in human history, a private company offered its future directly to the people. This was the world's very first IPO, initial public offering. But the idea didn't come out of nowhere. Plans for this move were already underway months earlier, in March, when the company signed its detailed charter. And when those shares hit the market, the response was electric. Capital poured in. Behind the VOC's sails were Amsterdam's elite, the quiet forces who kept the money flowing through the city's financial networks. But all of this raised a deeper question. How do you get powerful families, who usually compete with each other, to invest in a shared future? The answer? Once again, the House of Orange. See, the House of Orange didn't just support the VOC. They depended on its success. At home, politics were unstable. Amsterdam's merchants were pushing for tighter control under a republic. Meanwhile, the House of Orange remained stuck in this awkward role. They had royal ambition but no actual throne. And abroad, things were even more intense. Catholic superpowers like Habsburg Spain still saw Dutch independence as treason, a crime worth punishing by war. In that kind of pressure, feudal power just couldn't hold up. The House of Orange had no land full of serfs, no silver mines, no divine right to rule. What they did have was a new idea: rule through markets, not monarchies. This was revolutionary at the time. They helped build a new kind of power, one not tied to crowns or castles, but to systems. Financial institutions that made risk measurable, predictable, manageable, and at the core of that system were permanent shares. For the first time in history, ownership in a global company could be freely bought and sold. That gave birth to the world's first secondary market, the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. But it didn't stop there. Traders began taking it a step further. They weren't just buying shares, they started betting on what shares would do tomorrow. They speculated, they hedged, they arbitraged. All the tools you see on Wall Street today, they started here. And driving all of it was one timeless force: FOMO. FOCO shares created one of the first major episodes of financial fear of missing out. From a starting value of 100 guilders in 1602, shares climbed to nearly 1,000 by the 1720s, a tenfold jump, in a time with no internet, no mass media, just word of mouth and market signs. But there was still a risk. What if a ship went down? What if trade routes failed? The Dutch answered that with a legal invention that changed business forever: limited liability. For the first time, investors were only responsible for what they put in. If something went wrong, their personal property stayed safe, families were protected, and people invested with confidence. The VOC didn't just transform the Netherlands, its ideas started crossing borders, quietly but powerfully. They didn't just stay in Dutch ports or echo through merchant banks in Amsterdam. These financial concepts, public shares, stock markets, limited liability, traveled, and they landed where power was shifting next. One man, in particular, carried that influence further than anyone else: William of Orange. Born into the House of Orange-Nassau, William held the title of Prince from birth. That gave him status inside the Dutch Republic. But even more important than the title were the people he surrounded himself with. Dutch merchants, investors, thinkers, all of them shaped by the VOC and the Republic's financial mindset. But William's biggest impact came later, not in the Netherlands, but in England. By 1688, England was on the edge of political collapse. King James II had lost the trust of Parliament and most of the country. Tensions were high. So English leaders went looking for someone to step in. Someone Protestant, with a claim to the throne. They found Mary James's daughter and her husband, William of Orange. And when England called, William answered. He didn't just sail in with soldiers, he brought something else. An entirely new way of thinking about power. His mindset was shaped by the Dutch Republic. He didn't see finance as separate from government. He saw it as the foundation of governance. This moment became known as the Glorious Revolution, and soon after, William and Mary II were crowned in a rare joint monarchy. But this wasn't just a political reshuffle. It was a financial transformation. Under William's reign, England established the Bank of England, introduced public credit, issued government bonds, and started funding war through capital markets, not taxes alone. All of this? Straight from the Dutch model. But the story goes even deeper. Because decades before William ever set foot in England, Dutch ships were already crossing the Atlantic. In 1609, a VOC vessel, the Halve sailed into a harbour that would later become one of the most iconic financial capitals in history, New York City. Just a few years after that first Dutch ship arrived, in 1624, the Dutch West India Company established a small trading post at the southern tip of Manhattan. They named it New Amsterdam. At first glance, it looked like just another outpost, a collection of streets, warehouses, and merchant docks. But look closer, and the plan becomes clear. These streets weren't random. They were organized. The trade networks were efficient. The people, incredibly diverse. The Dutch weren't just settling. They were building something with purpose. A financial outpost of the New World. Amsterdam's influence showed up everywhere. In the way credit flowed, in how contracts were honored, and in how trade linked this tiny settlement to Europe's biggest markets. In 1664, the British seized the colony and renamed it New York. But here's what's interesting. They didn't tear it down. They didn't erase the Dutch systems. They kept them. The legal frameworks, the trade customs, the financial habits. Why? Because they worked. These structures quietly blended into British practice and endured. Meanwhile, back in Europe, another shift was happening. In the 1600s, Amsterdam and London had very different financial personalities. Amsterdam focused on public banks and credit stability. London leaned into speculation and faster-moving markets. By the 1700s, something clicked. The two systems began working together. Dutch reliability in clearing and deposit-taking started to complement British innovation in trading and securities. This partnership created a new kind of financial dominance, not military but economic. And it didn't stay in Europe. Because of colonial ties, especially through New Amsterdam and later British America, these ideas crossed the Atlantic. New York absorbed the best of both worlds, Dutch structure and British momentum. Over time, that foundation helped turn a small port into a financial capital. But while those systems were growing, the VOC itself was starting to break down. By the late 1700s, cracks were showing. Internal politics, corruption, competition from Britain and France. Oversight couldn't keep up with scale, and the company that once ruled the ocean started to collapse under its own weight. At first, the VOC held together. It managed to survive early signs of decline. But slowly, the core began to rot. Decision-making slowed, corruption spread. Officials cared more about lining their own pockets than protecting the company's future. The world was changing. Markets were evolving. New rivals, faster, more flexible, were rising. By 1795, the VOC was no longer untouchable. Its power had slipped, and eventually the Dutch state stepped in, nationalizing the company, a full takeover. In 1796, the VOC, once the most powerful trading force on Earth, was officially dissolved. But its legacy? That didn't vanish. What the VOC built, corporate architecture, shareholder systems, stock exchanges, multinational structures, became the blueprint for modern capitalism. Its methods didn't die with the company. They were absorbed, rewritten into global finance, into law, into institutions we still use today. And nowhere is that legacy clearer than in the Netherlands itself. Today, the Netherlands is no longer a colonial empire. It's a financial one. Its influence is global, found in corporate treaties, in offshore accounts, in boardrooms and investment banks. And the numbers say it all. The Netherlands consistently ranks among the world's most competitive economies. It's a magnet for global capital. Foreign direct investment flows in and out at staggering levels, over $4.3 trillion inward and $5.2 trillion outward. Dutch holdings abroad? Over 3. That's an enormous footprint for a country with fewer people than California. And still, behind this vast web of influence, stands the same name, the House of Orange Nassau. They still reign. Yes, the crown today is mostly ceremonial, but the connections aren't symbolic. The royal family continues to hold stakes in key Dutch industries, from energy to defense, and exerts quiet influence through foundations, trusts, and strategic partnerships. One name stands out above the rest: Royal Dutch Shell. Formed in 1907, when Royal Dutch merged with Shell Transport and Trading, Shell would dominate the global energy sector for over a century, and just like the VOC once did, it carried not only Dutch capital, but a royal title. The empire may have changed forms, but the architecture of power? It's still very much alive. When we hear the word capitalism, we usually think of skyscrapers, stock tickers, hedge funds, oil pipelines, and billionaire families that have shaped the flow of global wealth for generations. The Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, the Morgan. These names are etched into the concrete of the financial world. Their influence feels timeless, their empires so vast and intertwined with modern history that we almost assume they must have invented the game itself. But that assumption is a shadow, a mirage, because those names didn't create capitalism. They were just the latest masters of a system that began long before Wall Street ever ticked its first stock price. The origins of capitalism go further back, to a time before skyscrapers, before banks as we know them, before the Industrial Revolution even had a name, back to when power didn't live in corporations or central banks, but in crowns and royal crests. Back when trade was risky, war was constant, and money moved on the back of empires. And among those early forces shaping this new world, one dynasty saw the future more clearly than the others: the House of Orange. You don't hear their name in business circles today. They aren't plastered across investment portfolios or luxury real estate. But the system that made the Rothschilds and Rockefellers possible, it was sketched out by the House of Orange. They were the architects of a different kind of empire, one not rooted in land or title, but in finance, logistics, and the movement of capital itself. They didn't just use markets, they embedded them into national identity, and that story begins in one of the most unstable, violent, and visionary periods in European history, the 16th century. At that time, the Low Countries, what we now call the Netherlands and Belgium, were not a nation in the modern sense. They were a loose collection of provinces, cities, and territories that sat on the edge of empires, politically fractured, culturally complex, religiously divided, but exceptionally wealthy. The region had long been a hub of commerce, positioned at the intersection of trade routes that connected northern Europe to the Mediterranean and beyond. Its cities, Antwerp, Bruges, Amsterdam, were vibrant, international, and full of merchants who understood the language of risk and return. Banking families flourished, shipbuilders thrived, textiles, grain, and spices flowed through its ports, but its political fate was tied to a distant king, Philip II of Spain. Philip inherited control of the Low Countries through dynastic marriage and empire building. But he ruled from afar, from Madrid, with a heavy Catholic hand, to the Protestant provinces of the north. His rule was more than foreign, it was intrusive. And it wasn't just about religion, it was about control, about autonomy, about the ability to trade freely, speak freely, worship freely, and govern according to local traditions. Resentment simmered. Then it boiled. The Dutch Revolt, also known as the 80 Years' War, began in 1568, but it wasn't a sudden uprising. It was the result of decades of pressure, taxation, religious persecution, and the slow erosion of local governance. Spain tried to impose a centralized secular on a region that had always operated through city councils, merchant guilds, and negotiated freedoms. It was a mismatch of authority, a political miscalculation, and it ignited one of the longest and most transformative wars in European history. Into this chaos stepped a figure who would become synonymous with resistance. William of Orange, also known as William the Silent. He wasn't a revolutionary in the modern sense. He was a nobleman, born into wealth and influence. But he understood the deeper problem. This wasn't just a clash of armies or religious doctrine, it was a collision between two worldviews, one rooted in monarchy and absolute rule, the other emerging from the mercantile cities of the north, decentralized, entrepreneurial, pragmatic, and future-facing. William didn't just want to win battles, he wanted to build a system where power flowed, not from royal bloodlines, but from collective interests, from institutions, from commerce, from the people who built ships, financed voyages, and took risks every day in the marketplaces of the Netherlands. This wasn't theoretical, it was practical. The Spanish model of governance, hierarchical, feudal, aristocratic, was failing. It couldn't keep pace with the rapid changes sweeping Europe, the explosion of trade, the rise of urban centers, the spread of printing and new ideas. In contrast, the Dutch cities were dynamic, nimble, and deeply tied to global commerce. They weren't waiting for royal permission. They were building futures, one contract, one cargo, one market at a time. The House of Orange saw this, and instead of clinging to the past, they leaned into the future. Under William's leadership, the Dutch began to reimagine what a nation could be. Not a kingdom, but a republic. Not ruled by decree, but governed through consensus. And at the heart of this emerging republic was a radical idea that trade and capital were not just tools of prosperity, they were foundations of freedom. To fund their rebellion against Spain, the Dutch didn't turn to taxation alone, they innovated. They issued bonds. They created public financial instruments to raise capital from ordinary citizens. They built a network of trust between merchant, investor, and state. This wasn't charity, it was opportunity. The war became a public investment, one that offered returns if the republic survived. This shift was monumental. It marked the birth of what we now call financial capitalism, a system where risk is distributed, capital is pooled, and power is exercised not through land ownership but through liquidity. As the rebellion gained momentum, the Dutch began to institutionalize these changes. The Bank of Amsterdam was founded in 1609, providing a stable, trusted currency exchange that would anchor global trade. Stock exchanges began to emerge, creating transparent platforms for investment and speculation. Joint stock companies were chartered to fund long-distance voyages. Risk became measurable, profit became predictable, and power became scalable. At the center of all this stood the House of Orange, not as monarchs dictating from above, but as stewards of a new kind of nation, one that fused military resistance with economic transformation, one that saw trade routes as arteries of statehood, one that understood that ships, contracts, and credit could achieve what armies alone could not. But this transformation wasn't without friction. Traditional elites resisted. Foreign powers intervened. Even within the Netherlands, the tension between centralized leadership and decentralized governance never fully disappeared. The House of Orange was both celebrated and challenged. They were leaders, but also symbols of a republic that had no king but still needed a face. Over time, that role evolved. The House of Orange became the constitutional glue, a stabilizing force between merchants, ministers, and the military. They didn't control everything, but they influenced everything. And their influence was not just political, it was economic, cultural, and deeply psychological. They gave the republic a narrative, a sense of identity, a lineage that connected the chaotic present to a storied past, and to a future that felt increasingly global. Because, by the early 1600s, The Dutch weren't just fighting for their own sovereignty, they were becoming something else entirely, a trading superpower. Their ships crisscrossed the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea. Their merchants negotiated in dozens of languages. Their ports became gateways to the world. And their financial innovations, from bonds, bills of exchange, became the lingua franca of global capitalism. This was the world the House of Orange helped build, not through conquest but through coordination, not by declaring themselves kings, but by embedding their vision in the systems that would outlive them. And it's this legacy, invisible but immense, that set the stage for everything that came next. Because when you follow the money, when you trace the logic of how wealth moves, how systems scale, and how influence travels, it doesn't begin with Wall Street, or the Rockefellers, or the Rothschilds. It begins here, in the marshes and canals of the Low Countries, in the printing houses of Amsterdam, in the council chambers of Delft, and in the quiet but revolutionary vision of a royal family that saw what others couldn't yet imagine, that the future wouldn't be written in thrones or titles, it would be written in ledgers. By the end of the 16th century, the rebellion in the Low Countries had done more than challenge Spanish rule. It had reshaped the entire idea of what a country could be. The Dutch Republic had emerged not as a traditional monarchy, but as a decentralized federation of provinces held together by a common purpose, shared interests, and a growing belief that trade was not just a national activity, it was the national identity. And within that identity, a quiet revolution was taking place, not with flags or declarations, but with ink and numbers, in ledgers, contracts, and promissory notes. Because once the Dutch realized that they didn't need a king to govern, they also realized something even more radical. They didn't need a king to finance growth. Traditionally, empires had relied on royal treasuries, religious authority, or territorial conquests to fund expansion. Wealth was something extracted from the land, from the peasantry, from war spoils. But the Dutch flipped that model. They discovered that wealth could be constructed, engineered through systems, through trust, through markets. This was a society where merchants sat in government, where guilds had political voice, where private wealth was reinvested not in palaces, but in ships, canals, and infrastructure. And as the Republic solidified its independence, it turned to a new question. How do you scale this model? How do you go from a regional trading hub to a global commercial empire, without kings, without colonies, and without a standing army? The answer was found in finance. In 1602, just after the formation of the Dutch Republic, the Bank of Amsterdam was created. On the surface, it was a simple institution, a place where merchants could deposit gold and silver, receive receipts, and exchange currencies. But underneath, it was something far more powerful. It became a central trust engine, stabilizing the financial environment and allowing trade to function on a scale never seen before. It wasn't just about holding deposits. It was about creating confidence. The Bank of Amsterdam standardized value. It gave merchants a reliable counterparty. It made contracts meaningful across borders. And most of all, it turned trust into liquidity. Think about that. The ability to move money, not because you physically had it, but because you were trusted to have it. This changed everything. It meant deals could be made faster, that voyages could be financed without waiting for treasure, that expansion could happen without conquest. This trust-based system was revolutionary, and it didn't just sit in vaults, it flowed into the world. The Dutch created bills of exchange that functioned like early credit notes. Merchants could trade not only goods, but the promise of goods. They could sell shares in future cargo, finance risk, hedge against storms, delays, or price shifts in faraway markets. They were doing in the 1600s what modern financial markets would later turn into trillion-dollar systems. And all of this was happening in Amsterdam, a city that became, almost overnight, the beating heart of global commerce. Its port expanded, warehouses lined the canals, markets buzzed with speculation. You could walk the streets and hear dozens of languages, not from tourists, but from merchants, agents, financiers, and adventurers. Deals were made not with ceremony, but with handshakes and contracts. This was capitalism before the word existed. And behind this transformation was a culture that didn't fear risk. It calculated it. It measured. It invested. It scaled. The Dutch didn't just build ships. They built systems, paperwork, protocols, partnerships. And as the returns started flowing back in spices, silks, sugar, silver, so too did a new kind of power, the power of capitalized influence. Because once you understand capital as a system, not just a resource, you begin to realize something profound, that money, when structured correctly, can behave like a military. It can shape borders, it can enforce rules, it can extract value, it can move faster than an army, and last longer than a treaty. The House of Orange understood this. And while they didn't control the markets directly, they enabled the conditions under which these markets could thrive. They legitimized the financial tools. They offered legal protection to innovators. They aligned the military, not with conquest, but with commercial protection. The Dutch Navy wasn't used to subjugate people, it was used to secure trade routes. That shift from territorial conquest to economic corridor was subtle, but world-changing, because it opened the door to a new kind of empire. Not one built on flags and fortresses, but one built on flows of goods, of credit, of information. It was the beginning of a networked model of dominance, one that didn't require kings, only connectivity, and in this network, new ideas about ownership began to emerge. If you could finance a voyage with pooled capital, why not finance an entire company? If a ship could represent the interests of 30 investors, could a fleet represent thousands? And if the risk could be spread, could the rewards be scaled? These weren't philosophical questions. They were being asked and answered in real time by Dutch merchants, financiers, and government officials. Because the opportunity was clear, the East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, and beyond, were overflowing with high-value goods: cloves, nutmeg, pepper, textiles, and precious stones. But the Portuguese had long held dominance in the region. Their fleets had secured routes, and their forts dotted the coastline. Yet the Portuguese were weakening. Their empire was overstretched. Their alliances were fragile. Their bureaucracy was slow. And the Dutch smelled opportunity. But they didn't want to send dozens of small expeditions. Competing merchants would undercut each other, prices would fall, risks would multiply. There would be no coordination, no consistency. What they needed was unity, not just of vision, but of structure. And so the conversations began, between guilds, between financiers, between provincial governments, and eventually with the backing of the House of Orange and the States General, a decision was made that would forever reshape economic history, to form a single unified trading company, one with the exclusive right to conduct Dutch trade in the East Indies, one with the power to raise capital publicly, one that could operate as both a business and an arm of the state, one that would turn the principles of Dutch finance into a full-scale engine of global trade. It would be called the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or in English, the Dutch East India Company. But it wasn't just a company. It was an idea that capital could move faster than kings, that profit could build what politics could not, that influence, properly structured, could become infrastructure. In the year 1602, something unprecedented happened in the Dutch Republic, a single moment that would echo across centuries, industries, and ideologies. That year, 7 competing trading companies operating out of various Dutch provinces agreed to merge under one unified charter. They came from different cities: Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Delft, Hoorn, Enkhuizen, and others, each with its own backers, interests, and leadership. Yet they agreed to combine their ships, their capital, their infrastructure, and their ambitions into a single legal entity. The Dutch government, specifically the States General, granted this new entity exclusive rights to all Dutch trade in Asia for 21 years. That meant no other Dutch merchant or city could send ships east without going through this company. And so, the Dutch East India Company was born. In Dutch, Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, but this wasn't just a merger of trading companies. It was the creation of a new kind of organism. The VOC was not merely a business. It was a hybrid, part corporation, part government, part military, part bank. It was a legal person, able to sign contracts, wage war, and own property, completely separate from the individuals who funded it. That idea alone was revolutionary. This structure, the Joint Stock Corporation, was a profound leap forward in economic engineering, and it emerged from necessity. Global trade was hard. Long voyages across treacherous waters were expensive and risky. Ships could be lost to storms, pirates, or rival nations. Cargo could rot, markets could collapse, and funding a single expedition required enormous upfront capital. No single merchant or family could carry that kind of risk alone. But what if the risk could be spread? What if dozens or hundreds of investors could pool their money to fund a single voyage? And what if they could share in the profits, not just once, but continuously for years? This was the genius of the joint stock model. The VOC allowed ordinary citizens, wealthy and middle class alike, to purchase shares in the company. These shares could be bought and sold. They could rise and fall in value based on the company's performance, and in return, shareholders received dividends from the VOC's profits. This created a new relationship between citizen and empire. A dock worker in Amsterdam could, for the first time in history, own a piece of a global corporation. A baker in Rotterdam could invest in voyages to Sumatra and Java. A widow in Leiden could earn passive income from dividends tied to nutmeg and pepper. Capital was no longer a privilege of nobility. It was becoming democratized. Of course, not everyone had equal access. The majority of shares were still held by the wealthy, but the idea that ownership could be distributed, that risk could be pooled, and that reward could be scaled would shape the modern world forever. And this model didn't just transform who could invest. It transformed how power operated. The VOC was granted extraordinary privileges by the Dutch government. It could build forts. It could recruit soldiers and sailors. It could negotiate treaties with foreign rulers. It could mint its own coins. And yes, it could wage war. In essence, the VOC was given state-level powers, not by accident, but by design. The Dutch Republic was still young. It didn't have the resources to police vast oceanic routes or manage overseas colonies, but the VOC did. This was a public-private alliance centuries ahead of its time. The government provided the legal framework and naval support. The company provided the logistics, capital, and administration. And together they created a system where commerce could function as conquest, and profit could replace politics. The VOC was structured as a federation of regional chambers, each located in a different Dutch city, each with its own investors and directors. But at the top sat the Heren, the Visitum, the 17 Lords, a centralized board that coordinated strategy, oversaw finances, and approved major decisions. This blend of decentralization and central control gave the VOC incredible flexibility. Local knowledge could flourish, but global strategy was unified, and the results were immediate. By 1603, VOC ships were already sailing toward Asia, bypassing Portuguese trade routes and establishing their own direct relationships with local rulers. By 1605, they had captured the important Portuguese fort at Ambon in the Moluccas, a strategic spice-producing region. That single victory would reshape the spice trade and the VOC's fortunes for decades. But this early success wasn't just about military tactics, it was about scale. Because the VOC didn't send one ship, it sent fleets. It didn't make one-time trades, it established networks, warehouses, shipping timetables, contracts that spanned continents, port facilities, financial partnerships, diplomatic envoys. The VOC was building infrastructure, not just buying goods. It mapped coastlines, it tracked weather patterns, it studied market fluctuations in real time. It began keeping detailed records of its voyages, profits, losses, and logistical performance. The VOC pioneered the use of double-entry accounting, making sure every transaction was tracked, matched, and auditable. This wasn't just about bookkeeping, it was about scale, about ensuring that investors back home could trust the numbers, even if the voyage was 9 months long and 6,000 miles away. And that trust turned into more capital. More capital turned into more ships. More ships turned into more influence. It was a feedback loop, and it was working. But perhaps the most transformative idea behind the VOC wasn't logistical, it was philosophical. The Dutch were creating something the world had never truly seen before, an entity that lived across borders, functioned across cultures, and persisted across generations, yet was not tied to any one person, monarch, or family. The VOC could grow without its founders. It could adapt without new laws. It could die, or thrive, based entirely on performance and demand. It was alive in the markets, not in the palace. This idea that power could be structural, not personal, was the quiet revolution of capitalism. And it started here, with a royal family that had turned away from absolute rule and toward distributed influence, with a republic that had chosen trade over conquest and risk over hierarchy, with investors who saw not just goods but systems, and with a company that would soon become larger, richer, and more powerful than most countries on Earth. But the story of the VOC had only just begun. What they were about to build in Asia, the ports, the partnerships, the supply chains, would change the world forever. And as the company expanded, so would the questions. Where does corporate power end and national interest begin? What happens when a company controls diplomacy, defense, and profit? And who, if anyone, governs the governors? When the Dutch East India Company was officially formed in 1602, the world didn't shift all at once. There was no cannon blast, no turning point that historians can mark with a single date, but quietly, and with remarkable precision, a transformation began. One that would carry the Dutch from a small coastal republic to the commanding heights of the world's commercial stage. They didn't have an empire in the traditional sense. No sprawling colonies, no global navy like Spain or England, but they had something else. A structure, a network, and within that network, a vision. Not of land ruled, but of markets control. Not of armies on horseback, but of contracts, cargo, and shipping lanes. The VOC's charter had given it exclusive rights to trade between the Dutch Republic and the vast territories of Asia. This wasn't just a region of spices and silks, it was a mosaic of powerful kingdoms, merchant cities, tribal alliances, and empires that had thrived for centuries before a single European ship ever appeared on their shores. The Portuguese had arrived in the 1500s, carving out coastal strongholds in Goa, Malacca, and Macau. They controlled key choke points of trade, using fortified posts to extract taxes, enforce monopolies, and influence local rulers. The Spanish too had planted flags across the Pacific, linking Manila to the Americas through the galleon trade. The British, still early in their eastward expansion, were building their own network of posts and partners. So when the Dutch arrived, they weren't entering a vacuum. They were entering a crowded, competitive, politically sophisticated world. And they knew brute force wouldn't be enough. That's where their strategy diverged. The VOC didn't just come with ships. It came with data, with maps, with translators, with contracts, with negotiators who could adapt to cultural nuance, speak multiple languages, and read the subtle dynamics of royal courts, religious hierarchies, and merchant guilds. In Indonesia, they saw an archipelago of kingdoms, rich in nutmeg, cloves, and pepper. These weren't backward outposts. They were thriving societies with their own diplomacy, trade routes, and maritime systems. The Dutch didn't need to conquer them, at least not yet. They needed to insert themselves into existing networks. And they did it with remarkable efficiency. The VOC began establishing factories, trade stations that acted as both warehouses and diplomatic centers. The most important early one was in Ambon, in the Moluccas, also known as the Spice Islands. These islands were the source of some of the world's most valuable commodities at the time. Spices that European consumers were willing to pay extraordinary premiums for. Control of Ambon gave the VOC a foothold. But it wasn't just about geography, it was about relationships. The Dutch negotiated with local sultans, signed treaties with regional chiefs, and used both diplomacy and supply chain leverage to slowly displace the Portuguese. From there, they expanded into Batavia, a strategic location on the island of Java. In 1619, the VOC established it as its administrative and logistical capital in Asia. Over time, Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, would become one of the most important trade cities in the world. Not just a port, but a headquarters, a fusion point between Europe and Asia. From Batavia, the VOC coordinated hundreds of ships, thousands of employees, and entire regional economies. And this is where the VOC's model became most visible. They didn't just export goods, they exported systems. They introduced Dutch legal codes into contracts with local rulers. They implemented tax structures that mirrored those back home. They deployed bureaucrats and bookkeepers who documented every transaction. They required standardized weights and measures, created multilingual ledgers, and ensured that pricing structures reflected VOC priorities, not necessarily local ones. And yet, to many of the local societies, this wasn't conquest. It was business. It was opportunity. The VOC paid in coin, They brought goods from Europe that had real value: silver, textiles, weaponry, tools. In exchange, they offered local elites access to global trade networks. Rulers who once relied on regional alliances now saw a path to wealth and prestige through VOC partnership. This was the genius of the Dutch model: contractual dominance. By offering structured trade agreements, the VOC secured cooperation. By maintaining fortified posts, it discouraged betrayal. And by keeping its own army, and often a navy on site, it ensured that incentives were backed by deterrence. But unlike other empires, the VOC didn't want to govern the day-to-day lives of foreign populations. It didn't want to change religions, rewrite cultures, or impose new languages. It wanted compliance and continuity. If a region could produce goods, honor contracts, and maintain security, the VOC was happy to let it govern itself. And so the VOC spread. In India, it established posts in Surat and along the Coromandel coast, engaging in textile and spice trade, while cautiously navigating the complex political terrain dominated by the Mughal Empire. They were careful, knowing they were small players in a very big arena. Still, they made connections. They learned the rules. They adapted. In Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, they negotiated and eventually overtook Portuguese interests, securing a dominant position in cinnamon trade. Again, they didn't immediately conquer. They displaced slowly, deliberately, and usually with the cooperation of local factions who had grown tired of Portuguese arrogance. The VOC also reached Japan, establishing a long-standing trade outpost on the man-made island of Dejima, near Nagasaki. In a world increasingly skeptical of foreign influence, the Dutch became Japan's sole Western trading partner for over 2 centuries, in part because they focused on trade, not religion or ideology. Everywhere the VOC went, it adapted, but it also extracted, not violently, not chaotically, but through structure. It measured out influence like currency. It mapped supply chains like military campaigns. It assessed local leadership, not for loyalty but for stability. And always, it asked the same question: can this region be made predictable? Because that was the VOC's real goal. Not conquest, but predictability. Predictable output. Predictable logistics, predictable prices, predictable risk. Because once you had that, you could forecast, you could invest, you could scale. And for VOC shareholders back in Amsterdam, stability was profit. This is how the VOC became more than a company. It became a global logic system. It was one of the first entities in human history to manage complexity at this scale, not just across geography but across culture, language, religion, and time. They had standardized reporting systems, hierarchical command structures that reported from Batavia back to Amsterdam, early human resources management, with contracts for captains, traders, and soldiers, even health records and port sanitation protocols, not out of compassion, but to keep voyages profitable. And as this system grew, so did its influence, not just over regions, but over the very idea of what power looked like. Because this wasn't the power of kings. It was the power of structure, of redundancy, scalability, and delegation, of influence embedded in process. The VOC didn't just build forts, it built flows. It didn't just move goods, it moved behavior. It became the world's first corporate shadow empire, not imposing rule, but enveloping the world within a system that, once entered, was hard to escape. And as we'll explore in the next segments, that system had both brilliance and consequences. To keep a global machine like the VOC running, the Dutch knew they needed more than contracts and ledgers. They needed something to secure the margins, to protect their posts, enforce their agreements, and remind both rivals and partners that behind every negotiation was strength. But unlike traditional empires, the VOC didn't begin with conquest. It began with contingency. Its approach to power was layered: diplomacy first, incentive second, and force only if necessary. But the VOC made sure that force was always available. From its earliest decades, the company maintained a standing army of professional soldiers and naval forces. These were not Dutch national troops. They were private military forces, recruited, trained, and paid by the company. They operated under VOC command, not under any European monarch, and they were deployed not to expand territory, but to secure trade. This was a different kind of military logic. Most European empires used force to conquer, to subjugate, to expand borders, but the VOC used force to lock in revenue. Their military wasn't aimed at controlling populations, it was aimed at controlling routes, at keeping choke points stable, at ensuring that the terms of agreements, those carefully negotiated contracts, were upheld. In this way, VOC fortresses were not symbols of domination. They were nodes in a supply chain. Their walls protected warehouses, not churches. Their gates defended shipping docks, not royal palaces. One of the most important of these nodes was on the southern tip of Africa, a place that would become central to Dutch imperial logistics, Cape Town. In 1652, the VOC established a permanent settlement at the Cape of Good Hope, a natural halfway point between Europe and Asia. The VOC ships sailing from Amsterdam to Batavia would stop there to resupply, repair, and refresh their crews. It was not founded as a colony in the beginning, it was a service station, a warehouse, a garden. But over time, things changed. The company began to settle farmers in the region, not to grow crops for export, but to supply VOC ships with fresh food and meat. These settlers, known as Boers, brought with them European agricultural practices and legal systems, and inevitably this meant land, and the displacement of indigenous Khoikhoi populations. This wasn't a conquest, at least not at first. It was logistical sprawl. The VOC needed food for ships. Food required land. Land led to fences. Fences led to borders. Borders led to conflict. And so, almost unintentionally, a shipping post turned into a colony, one that would later play a pivotal role in South African history, long after the VOC itself was gone. This pattern of logistics turning into governance repeated itself across the VOC's global network. In Southeast Asia, trading outposts evolved into administrative hubs. In Ceylon, spice contracts turned into taxation systems. In Formosa, modern-day Taiwan, failed trade missions turned into territorial ambitions. But in each case, the VOC wasn't expanding for glory or ideology. It was expanding to reduce friction in its supply chains. The logic was always economic. Control meant fewer surprises. Fewer surprises meant lower risk. And lower risk meant higher return. This framework required not only soldiers and sailors, but administrators, clerks, bookkeepers, surveyors, translators, quartermasters, contract lawyers. By the mid-1600s, the VOC employed tens of thousands of people, both in Europe and across its Asian and African networks. And here, a new challenge emerged. As the company grew, so did its bureaucracy. The decentralized chambers of the Netherlands, which had once provided flexibility and innovation, now began to struggle with coordination. Each regional board had its own interests, its own preferred suppliers, its own political connections. Meanwhile, VOC officials posted overseas, in Batavia, Cape Town, Surat, or Malacca, had to make rapid decisions, often without waiting for approval from Amsterdam. The result? Autonomy that sometimes drifted into contradiction. Instructions from home could take months to arrive. By the time new orders were received, the local situation had changed. This time lag created both opportunity and opacity. Some governors used it to build powerful local fiefdoms, controlling commerce, labor, and diplomacy with minimal oversight. Others became quietly corrupt, skimming profits or striking deals off the books. Some just got tired. The pressure, the climate, the distances, it all wore them down. And yet, the machine kept moving. The VOC had become too large to stop. It had created entire economies around its logistics. Dock workers, weavers, carpenters, farmers, sailors, accountants, translators, cooks, teachers, soldiers, and scribes, all dependent, directly or indirectly, on the system continuing to function. Its investors back in the Netherlands rarely saw these complexities. They saw balance sheets, dividend, returns, and as long as the ledgers showed black ink instead of red, the system seemed stable. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Not dramatic ones, not yet, but structural ones. The kind of cracks that appear when a system outgrows its founders, when complexity increases faster than oversight, when rules built for a small company are forced to govern a global machine. Still, to the outside world, the VOC was a marvel. It had created an empire without an emperor. It had built a global brand without mass media. It had standardized trade across dozens of currencies, languages, and governments, long before any nation had a central bank or foreign exchange policy. Its ships crossed oceans with astonishing regularity. Its ports buzzed with international commerce. Its documents, contracts, inventories, letters, and maps formed a body of knowledge that would shape European perceptions of Asia, Africa, and the East for centuries. But perhaps its most enduring legacy was the idea it carried, that markets could govern, that commerce could organize the world, and that private capital could operate at the scale of nations. That idea would inspire generations to come. British merchants would study the VOC model and apply it to their own East India Company. French financiers would copy its joint stock structure. Even American revolutionaries, years later, would borrow from its language, understanding that distributed ownership, market logic, and representative governance weren't just business tools, they were blueprints for modern power. But in the moment, in the 17th century, the VOC was not thinking about legacy. It was thinking about margins, and for those margins to remain, it needed stability. That's why it monitored monsoon seasons, built lighthouses, and maintained intelligence networks to track local politics. That's why it trained its own linguists, its own surveyors, its own medics. That's why it backed insurance pools and invested in cartography. Every variable that could be controlled, not for control's sake, but for profit's sake. This was capitalism as an operating system, before the word capitalism had even entered the global vocabulary. And in that system, the VOC wasn't just a company. It was an organism, adapting, replicating, mutating across borders, and it was growing faster than anyone could have predicted. The Dutch East India Company was many things: a trading powerhouse, a military operator, a financial innovation, and a pioneer of multinational governance. But there's one more layer to the VOC's global influence that often goes unnoticed, one that wasn't measured in gold or spices, but in paper, ink, and imagination. The VOC didn't just move goods, it moved information. From the beginning, the company treated knowledge as a strategic asset. Every ship was required to maintain detailed journals. Every port kept ledgers. Every transaction, no matter how small, was recorded. Dates, locations, quantities, weather, crew health, local contacts, contract terms, travel conditions, and even the political mood of local courts. Over time, this created a vast archive, an early form of institutional memory. What spices were selling well in Bruges? What routes were too risky in typhoon season? Which ports required bribes? And how much? Which captains managed their crews best? Which suppliers in Java delivered on time and which always ran late? The VOC didn't just store this information. It analyzed it, compared it, cross-referenced it. By the mid-17th century, the VOC was arguably operating the most sophisticated private information network in the world. It employed mapmakers who used first-hand sailing logs to update coastlines and revise nautical charts. It sponsored linguists to translate and standardize regional dialects, creating dictionaries for use in negotiations. It trained ship captains not only in navigation but in interpersonal diplomacy, regional law, and local religious customs. This wasn't altruism. It was operational efficiency. The more the VOC knew, the fewer surprises it faced. The fewer surprises, the less risk. And less risk meant higher returns. But this accumulation of knowledge had a second effect, a cultural one. Back in Amsterdam, the VOC's records became windows into the world. Merchants read voyage accounts. Printers published maps based on VOC charts. Households displayed porcelain from Asia and drank coffee, tea, and chocolate imported by VOC ships. Paintings began to depict not just Dutch landscapes, but foreign ports, exotic goods, and imagined scenes of distant peoples. The VOC wasn't just exporting Dutch goods, it was importing foreign awareness. It changed how Dutch society saw itself. No longer a small European republic fighting for survival, the Netherlands began to imagine itself as a cosmopolitan center, a middleman between East and West, a nation defined not by its size, but by its reach. Children of merchants dreamed not of farms, but of fleets. Bookstores sold travelogues. Colleges studied geography, trade law, and maritime navigation. The Dutch Republic became, through the VOC, a nation of data, and that identity had power. It gave Dutch investors a sense of control over events they would never witness. It gave politicians leverage over foreign affairs without declaring war. It gave citizens a feeling that they were participants in something vast, even if they never left home. But not everyone celebrated this transformation. As the VOC grew, so did unease. In church sermons, some ministers began to question the morality of profit without proximity. How could shareholders in Amsterdam benefit from a system they never saw? Who bore the cost of those profits? The labor, the health, the trust broken on distant shores. Inside the company itself, some officers wrote of their discomfort. Journal entries survived describing local famines that coincided with VOC shipments. Others mentioned coercion in spice-producing islands. Farmers forced into quotas they couldn't meet. Still others observed how local leaders who resisted the VOC were quietly removed or replaced, not through official wars but through withheld contracts, strategic alliances, or economic isolation. The VOC had no ideology. It was not nationalist, it was not religious. It didn't seek to convert or colonize in the traditional sense, but its neutrality was also its greatest armor, because without moral ambition, there was also no moral limit. The company would trade with Hindu princes, Muslim sultans, Buddhist monks, or Chinese mandarins. It would honor contracts as long as they were profitable, and if they weren't, it would renegotiate, or walk away, or escalate, with ships, soldiers, or political pressure. This flexibility made the VOC resilient, but it also made it hard to hold accountable. Who could challenge it? It wasn't a government. It wasn't bound by elections or constitutions. It reported to its shareholders, not its subjects. And when criticism arose, it didn't silence voices through censorship. It outpaced them through dividends. And yet, beneath this impersonal structure, there were still people, and not just in the Netherlands. Across Asia and Africa, entire communities began to live within the VOC's shadow. Some prospered. Local leaders who aligned with the company found new wealth and connections. Others resisted and were sidelined. Still others simply adapted, reshaping their societies to fit the VOC's rhythm, planting what the Dutch demanded, working to Dutch schedules, signing Dutch contracts. And even in the Netherlands, the glow began to dim. By the late 1600s, critics were asking new questions. Had the VOC become too big, too removed, too dependent on systems no one could fully understand? Inside the chambers, meetings grew longer. Disagreements multiplied. Was the company serving the Republic or just itself? Could a private institution really be trusted to act in the public interest on the other side of the world? Some compared it to a new kind of monarchy, a crownless sovereign, answerable to no one but its own structures. Still, the system continued, because on paper, it worked, goods flowed, returns were delivered, and the Dutch Republic remained one of the wealthiest, most connected societies on earth. But the seeds of contradiction had already been planted. The VOC had created a world of unprecedented interconnection, but also unequal visibility. The people who benefited from the system rarely saw its costs. The people who bore the costs rarely saw its rewards. And that imbalance, structural, not personal, would over time become the VOC's greatest weakness. It wasn't corruption or mismanagement that would end the Dutch East India Company. It was something more subtle, a system that had grown too complex to question, too powerful to regulate, too abstract to feel, even as it shaped the daily lives of millions. For more than a century, the Dutch East India Company had been the pride of the Republic, a symbol of Dutch ingenuity, precision, and economic brilliance. Its ships were legendary. Its trade networks spanned oceans. Its profits fueled cities, art, and innovation back home. On the surface, it looked invincible. But underneath, far beneath the ledgers and forts and dividends, a slow unraveling had begun. The VOC had become a machine, not metaphorically, but structurally. Its operations were governed by flowcharts, schedules, bureaucratic procedures, reporting hierarchies, and standardized contracts. Every ship had its paperwork. Every port had its protocols. Every trade had its taxonomies. And like all machines, it was designed to run smoothly until it wasn't. Because machines don't adapt emotionally. They don't sense fatigue. They don't feel hesitation, risk, or doubt. They just keep moving, keep processing, keep outputting, unless someone tells them to stop. But by the 1700s, the VOC had become so large, so self-perpetuating, that few people inside the system could even imagine stopping it. Every outpost was dependent on the next. Every ship relied on a port. Every port relied on contracts. Every contract relied on compliance. Every layer of this system needed every other layer to function. And function it did, but not always wisely. Because as the VOC scaled, it began to outgrow its intelligence. Not in terms of data, it had plenty, but in terms of context. Decisions made in Batavia were filtered through reports sent to Amsterdam, where directors read them months later in climate-controlled rooms with ink pens and ledgers. A policy shift decided in Holland could take months to reach Ceylon, and by the time it did, the situation might be completely different. In this lag, something dangerous grew. Distance from consequence. The VOC didn't set out to cause harm, but it wasn't built to notice when it did. Because the very features that had made it so powerful, scale, abstraction, systems, also created blind spots. A procurement officer didn't see the community disrupted by a new warehouse. A shipping clerk didn't see the farmland converted to meet spice quotas. The manager in Amsterdam didn't meet the people whose fishing routes were interrupted by VOC naval patrols. The company wasn't ignoring suffering. It just wasn't programmed to detect it. Its metrics were tonnage, turnaround time, revenue per shipment, contract renewal rate, crew survival percentage, local compliance ratios. There was no line item for cultural loss, no KPI for psychological strain, no quarterly report that asked, who is adapting to whom, and why? And so, slowly, quietly, the system began to shift. Not because of sabotage or failure, but because systems that don't self-correct eventually drift. In the field, VOC officers began bending rules, not maliciously, but out of necessity. Ports delayed shipments. Clerks fudged inventory numbers to avoid punishment. Traders made side deals with local elites, not for personal enrichment, but to keep things running. Schedules became harder to meet. Margins tightened. More energy was spent maintaining the illusion of efficiency than actually achieving it. Back in the Netherlands, investors still received dividends, but the quality of those returns began to fluctuate. Profits depended more and more on aggressive taxation, forced production agreements, and extraction-based contracts that squeezed local partners for more than they could realistically offer. In island communities across the Indonesian archipelago, complaints began to rise. Farmers were unable to grow their own food because they were bound by quotas. Local leaders were caught between loyalty to their people and obligation to VOC contracts. Some regions suffered under artificial scarcity, as spices were hoarded to maintain prices in Europe. Others faced disease and food shortages when local agricultural systems were disrupted. But these realities rarely made it into company reports. The VOC's reporting system didn't filter for suffering, it filtered for risk. And as long as the numbers could be managed, the system continued. And here's where the VOC begins to look very familiar. Because today, in the 21st century, we talk about globalization, about the scale of corporate influence, about systems that stretch across countries and cultures, powered by algorithms, contracts, and quarterly earnings calls. But we've seen this before. In the VOC, we see the prologue to modern corporate systems. Systems that reward performance, scale efficiency, and prioritize measurable outcomes over intangible ones. Unlike the VOC, many modern systems struggle to see their externalities. Who pays for the convenience? Who gets displaced by the data? Who absorbs the uncertainty created by another layer of scale? In the VOC's time, these questions were not abstract, they were lived. In Batavia, the company had become a government in all but name. It appointed officials, administered justice, collected taxes, and set laws, all under the guise of trade management. Locals referred to the VOC not as a company, but as an entity, something that wasn't alive, but also couldn't be removed. And this invisibility made it harder to oppose. The VOC didn't demand flags or oaths. It demanded out. It didn't care about loyalty. It cared about compliance. And for those who couldn't comply, options were limited. Some fled to other regions. Some adapted, building parallel economies around VOC operations. Some resisted quietly, sabotaging supply chains, hiding production, or creating alliances outside the company's purview. But resistance was rarely coordinated. The VOC didn't operate like a state. It didn't have a palace to march against. It had ships, offices, ledgers, forts, dispersed power, distributed architecture. There was no head to cut off, only systems to endure. And as these systems deepened, so did the company's internal contradictions. Managers reported frustration. Budgets ballooned. Repairs on ships took longer. New recruits had to be trained more often. The cost of doing business rose, slowly at first, then steadily. And at the same time, the global trade environment was changing. The British East India Company was growing more aggressive. The French were expanding their influence. The local rulers the VOC had once depended on were growing more cautious, some even hostile. The company's internal metrics still looked strong, but its strategic flexibility was shrinking. And worst of all, its identity was fading. It no longer innovated. It maintained. It no longer built. It preserved. And that shift from invention to inertia would mark the beginning of its long, slow unraveling. By the early 1700s, the Dutch East India Company was still vast, its network still impressive, its ships still crossing oceans, its warehouses still full. But underneath, the engine was grinding. It hadn't stopped, exactly. It had just become heavier. Every decision took longer. Every voyage cost more. Every repair revealed another delay. Every ledger hid a little more creative accounting. The VOC was not collapsing. It was sinking under its own complexity. And like many systems that grow too large, it didn't fail in a dramatic explosion. It began to sag slowly, structurally, inexorably. In its golden age, the VOC had thrived on precision. It knew the cost of a spice shipment down to the gram. It knew how long a crew could go before water had to be refreshed. It tracked the health of its soldiers, the cargo weight of its ships, and the tidal schedules of dozens of foreign ports. But as the company expanded, and as its staff, ships, ports, and contracts multiplied, so did the exceptions, the delays, the misalignments. A ship built in Amsterdam might not match the dock configuration in Batavia. A tax structure designed for a coastal region might fail in a mountainous province. An official stationed in Surrey might misreport figures, not out of malice, but because he couldn't get accurate data from his own supply chain. The machine that once ran on clarity was now running on correction. But corrections take time, and money, and coordination. And the VOC, once known for its razor-sharp efficiency, was now bleeding in all three. To compensate, the company began borrowing. At first, it was temporary, short-term debt to cover seasonal fluctuations. But over time, it became routine. The VOC wasn't borrowing to grow anymore. It was borrowing to function. To pay salaries, to maintain forts, to repair ships that were too old and too critical to decommission. Debt, once an instrument of strategic expansion, became a default operating mode. And as the company's financial obligations grew, so did its political entanglements. The Dutch government, which had once granted the VOC autonomy, began to reassert control, not out of imperial ambition, but out of necessity. The company had become too large, too central to Dutch commerce, to allow failure, and so, state involvement deepened. But this wasn't a bailout in the modern sense. It was a slow tethering. More audits, more oversight, more influence from political factions who saw the VOC not just as a company, but as an extension of Dutch national identity. In the public eye, the VOC still held symbolic power. It was printed in paintings, referenced in poems, featured in school lessons. For many Dutch citizens, it was the pride of the Republic, proof that a small country could build a global system based not on land, but on trade, not on armies, but on networks. But sentiment was shifting. In merchant circles, investors began to murmur. Dividends had shrunk. Reports were delayed. Rumors of inefficiency, even corruption, began to circulate, especially among those who understood how the company used to operate. For the average Dutch citizen, it was harder to tell. The VOC had always been a mystery, both admired and opaque. Its global complexity was hard to grasp. Its symbols, the ships, the coins, the ledgers, still conveyed power, but questions began to surface. Why were returns lower? Why were some voyages taking longer? Why were complaints from Asia appearing more often in letters? Why did the company, once so innovative, seem stuck? These weren't just financial concerns. They were cultural symptoms. The VOC had once represented the best of Dutch values: boldness, efficiency, adaptability, intelligence. Now it seemed to represent inertia. Meetings without movement. Reports without clarity. A system with more inputs than insight. And yet, it persisted. Because even in decline, the VOC was necessary. Too many jobs depended on it. Too many contracts were locked in. Too many cities had built their economies around VOC ports, warehouses, and infrastructure. To shut it down would be to unravel a large part of Dutch commercial life. So instead, the company did what many large systems do when performance falters. It defaulted to process. Meetings were held. Reforms were discussed. Proposals were drafted. New directors were appointed with promises of modernization. But the deeper issue remained. The company wasn't failing from a lack of ideas. It was failing from a lack of elasticity. Its structures, once revolutionary, were now frozen. It had too many obligations, too many dependencies, too many conflicting incentives. Even reforms, when attempted, faced a dilemma. Change too fast, and the system would break. Change too slowly, and the decline would continue. This is the danger of systems that succeed at scale. They become unquestionable, not because they are perfect, but because they are entrenched. The VOC was still respected, but that respect had hardened into a kind of institutional silence. People trusted it because they had to. Because to question the VOC too deeply would be to question the systems that supported much of Dutch wealth, power, and national pride. And this silence, not malicious, not conspiratorial, just deeply cultural, allowed the company's decline to continue with remarkably little resistance. Inside the chambers, directors debated cost-cutting. They argued over overseas staffing. They proposed new routes, new taxation models, new efficiency drives. But the core structure, the scaffolding that had once allowed the VOC to soar, was now cemented in place. New ideas struggled to gain traction. Reforms moved slowly. Internal factions grew. Not ideological, but practical. One chamber wanted more autonomy. Another wanted tighter control. Some regions demanded investment. Others threatened to pull out. It wasn't chaos. It was decay. Structured, methodical, procedural decay. The kind that unfolds over years, not months. And still, the company moved forward. It wasn't making headlines. It wasn't collapsing. But the ground beneath it was shifting. And in the quiet between each quarterly meeting, between each long voyage, between each audit and adjustment, something else was building. A realization that the company wasn't going to recover. Not because it didn't want to, but because it no longer could. By the mid-1700s, the Dutch East India Company was still afloat, still operating, still technically profitable. Its ships still moved through the Indian Ocean. Its warehouses still processed spices, textiles, and tea. Its clerks still filed ledgers, wrote reports, and signed contracts. But something had changed, something deeper than numbers. The company no longer believed in itself. What had once been a sharp, agile, and innovative structure was now brittle, rigid, sluggish. The VOC, once the embodiment of Dutch ingenuity and global discipline, had become a ghost of its former design, still functioning, but no longer evolving. And when systems stop evolving, they don't collapse right away. They fade. The symptoms were all there. Rising debt, internal disputes, aging infrastructure, slower voyages, more frequent losses, stagnant returns. But the company had learned to operate under strain. It had normalized dysfunction. It had built entire workflows around holding the structure together, rather than moving it forward. And that held. For a while. But the world around it didn't wait. By the 1750s and 60s, the British East India Company was rapidly ascending. The French, too, were expanding in Southeast Asia and Africa. Local rulers, once dependent on VOC partnerships, had grown more self-reliant or turned to other European rivals with better offers, faster ships, and more aggressive tactics. The VOC's once cutting-edge systems were now outdated. Its maps, once prized, were being replaced. Its bureaucracies, once admired, were now barriers to action. Reports came late. Supplies were misrouted. Ships required costly repairs. Forts stood under-maintained. Salaries were delayed. And yet, the company persisted, not because of performance, but because of political gravity. By then, the VOC was so entangled with the Dutch government, the Dutch economy, and the Dutch psyche that untangling it seemed unthinkable. Cities had grown around VOC ports. Families lived off VOC pensions. Investors still held shares, not because they expected windfall, but because selling meant admitting that the system had run its course. And so, denial settled in. Even as auditors raised red flags, even as reforms were proposed, even as internal memos described serious structural risks, the institution continued. It wasn't stubborn, it was simply structurally obligated to continue. But cracks became fractures. In the 1780s, a series of financial crises began to ripple through the company. Wars in Europe disrupted trade, colonial disputes drained resources, the company's debts became unsustainable. Directors debated nationalizing the company outright. Others fought to salvage it with reforms. New charters, new taxes, new boards. But it was too late. The VOC had built its empire on contracts, logistics, and confidence. And by the late 1790s, all three were failing. Confidence evaporated as dividends disappeared. Logistics collapsed under bloated chains and inflexible systems. Contracts became liabilities, obligations the company could no longer fulfill without further debt. And so on December 31, 1799, the Dutch East India Company was officially dissolved. No ceremony, no dramatic declaration, just a legal conclusion to a corporate experiment that had lasted nearly 200 years. The assets of the VOC, its forts, ships, debts, and colonies were absorbed by the Dutch state, effectively nationalizing its remnants. What had begun as a private enterprise had, by necessity, ended as a government responsibility. But this wasn't just the death of a company. It was the end of an era. The VOC was never just a business. It was a prototype. It had shown the world that companies could function like states, could command armies, negotiate treaties, govern cities, and shape entire regions. It had introduced systems that are now taken for granted: joint stock structures, shareholder governance, global supply chains, corporate bureaucracy, legal abstraction, financial centralization. It had proven that capital could scale in ways monarchs could not, and that structures could outlive their architects. Its fall, then, wasn't a scandal or a tragedy. It was a transformation. The Dutch Republic didn't just lose a company. It inherited a legacy, a set of systems, ideas, and tools that would quietly migrate into new institutions, national banks, public trading companies, central ministries, and eventually modern governments and multinational corporations. Because the VOC didn't vanish. It evolved. Its ships may have stopped sailing. Its books may have been closed. But the blueprint, the corporate DNA, had already been released into the world. And in the centuries that followed, it would be copied, modified, and scaled by nations far more powerful than the Netherlands ever was. Britain, France, the United States, Japan, China. The structures the VOC helped pioneer, distributed ownership, managerial hierarchy, standardized reporting, supply chain integration, became the skeleton of global capitalism. But in that skeleton was a question. If a company can become as powerful as a state, who decides what it serves? Who governs the governors? The VOC never answered that question. Not because it refused, but because it was never asked. The system it created was too new, too fast-moving, too self-validating to pause and reflect. And perhaps that is its most important legacy. Not just the maps, the coins, the contracts, but the warning that systems built to optimize can forget to ask why. That scale can blur accountability. That success, when defined only by output, can blind even the best designed institutions. And that sometimes the most dangerous systems are the ones that work until they don't. When the Dutch East India Company finally dissolved at the end of the 18th century, it left behind more than ports, forts, and unpaid debts. It left behind a new kind of architecture, one made of contracts instead of cannons, of accounting columns instead of royal decrees, of boardrooms instead of thrones. And what made this architecture so powerful and so enduring is that it didn't need to be seen to be felt. You couldn't march against it. You couldn't vote it out. It didn't wear a crown, wave a flag, or pledge allegiance to any one land, culture, or ideology. It simply functioned. Through systems. Through flows of goods, credit, influence, and decisions, each small on its own, but vast in accumulation. And centuries later, we are still living inside that structure. Not because the VOC succeeded, but because it designed a system that could outlive failure, Today, when we talk about the scale of modern corporations, of banks too big to fail, platforms too powerful to regulate, and supply chains too complex to trace, we are not witnessing something new. We are witnessing an evolution of something very old. The VOC was the first to fully realize that capital, when scaled properly, becomes its own form of sovereignty. It doesn't need territory. It needs access. It doesn't need armies. It needs leverage. It doesn't need citizens. It needs users, consumers, workers, moving through systems that are quietly shaped by goals they will never see, written by hands they will never know. This isn't conspiracy. It's design. Because the VOC showed the world that power could be structured, rather than embodied. It didn't need kings, queens, or emperors to project influence. It needed a ledger, a shipping manifest, a network of loyal intermediaries, a handful of incentives, 1,000 rules, and the discipline to scale. That structure, impersonal, portable, and invisible, became the foundation for global capitalism, and with it came an inversion of the old world. Where monarchs once governed markets, now markets began to govern monarchs. Where land once defined power, now liquidity did. Where armies once secured trade, now trade dictated the shape of armies. It didn't happen overnight. But slowly, century by century, the logic spread. Not because it was forced, but because it was useful. And that may be the most profound insight the VOC leaves us with. That the most powerful systems don't conquer, they convince. They offer benefits, efficiencies, connections, possibilities. And in exchange, they ask very little. Just compliance. Just participation. Just the willingness to not ask too many questions. Because the system is working, isn't it? Ships are moving. Products are arriving. Returns are flowing. Everything looks fine. Until it doesn't. Until something breaks. Until a link in the chain snaps. A market crashes. A supply line freezes. A system buckles under its own weight. And then we remember this power we take for granted, this structure we move through every day, is not neutral. It was built. It has priorities. It has a logic. And that logic, if left unexamined, shapes more than just economies. It shapes people. It defines which communities thrive and which ones disappear from maps. It decides which voices are counted and which are translated into numbers. It determines who is seen as a stakeholder and who is treated as externality. This isn't history. This is now. Because the DNA of the VOC lives on. In multinational corporations with their own diplomatic arms. In legal frameworks that allow companies to operate across borders without a home. In stock markets that reward efficiency but rarely ethics. In systems that distribute risk upward and responsibility downward. But the VOC doesn't just warn us about corporations. It warns us about ourselves. About what happens when we let systems grow faster than our understanding of them. When we treat success as an excuse not to ask what's being optimized and for whom. Because in the end, the VOC was not evil. It was efficient. It was not tyrannical. It was pragmatic. It was not cruel. It was indifferent. And in that indifference, in that quiet, systemic prioritization of output over outcome, it teaches us something vital. That the greatest threat to human dignity is not always force. Sometimes, it's function. A machine that cannot see what it was never designed to look for. A structure that continues not because it is right, but because it is routinized. A model of power that hides not in secrecy but in scale. So vast it seems natural. So embedded it seems permanent. But no system is permanent. And no structure is beyond questioning. The VOC was born of vision. It scaled with discipline, it declined with silence, and it vanished without revolution. Not because it was defeated, but because it had already passed on its logic into the bloodstream of the modern world. We are all downstream of that inheritance now, and the question is not whether we approve. The question is, do we see it? Do we recognize the outlines? Do we hear the echoes? Do we know when the system is working, and when it's working at someone's cost? These are not easy questions. But they are the only ones worth asking. Because in a world where power no longer wears a crown, we must learn to recognize the shape of invisible empires. Not so we can destroy them, but so we can decide consciously whether we still want to live inside them. Centuries ago, the House of Orange understood something that even today feels revolutionary. They saw that a crown, gleaming, heavy, symbolic, was not the only way to hold power. They saw that capital could do what armies couldn't. That contracts could bind more tightly than borders. that systems could last longer than dynasties. They didn't need to control people. They just needed to control the structure around them. And that insight became the quiet core of the Dutch East India Company, a company that didn't just build trade routes, but built a new way of thinking about power. Power not as a person, or a place, or a throne, but as a pattern, a model, a repeatable, exportable, refinable system that could scale across oceans and outlive its founders. And in many ways, that system never ended. It just changed shape. Today, we live in a world where the word company often means more than the word country, where corporations fund political campaigns, dictate wage structures, control supply chains, build communications networks, and shape how we speak, think, and connect. They do not fly flags. They do not hold elections. They do not ask for loyalty, only attention, participation, efficiency. They are not bound to land. They are bound to logic, to spreadsheets, to performance metrics. And if we pause, just for a moment, we can hear the echo of something very old, of ledger books written in candlelight, of long voyages mapped by men who would never return, of decisions made by boards who never saw the communities they affected, of a system so vast and well-structured that it worked, even when no one fully understood how. The Dutch East India Company is gone. Its ships have rotted. Its forts have been repurposed or swallowed by time. Its currency no longer trades. Its name, for many, has faded into textbooks and maritime museums, but the deeper legacy, the architecture of capitalized governance, lives on. And in many ways, it has only become more perfect, more frictionless, more silent, more invisible. Because today, systems don't need to be defended by fortresses. They are defended by terms of service, by patent, by legal entities and algorithmic filters, by intellectual property, by data. The new fleets do not carry spices. They carry servers, platforms, attention, behavior, but the blueprint is the same. Design the system, distribute the risk, centralize the reward, diffuse accountability, scale, and scale, and scale, until the system itself feels natural, like the weather, something you move through, something that shapes you even if you can't name it. But here's the truth. These systems aren't nature. They are made, crafted, engineered by people, with choices that reflect assumptions, incentives, and beliefs, just like the VOC, just like every structure that has come since. And this is why history matters. Not just to understand what happened, but to understand what we've inherited. Because you are not just living in a country, you are living in an architecture, a structure of influence that moves faster than governments, lasts longer than elections, and scales bigger than cities. And the most dangerous thing we can do is forget that. Forget that we are moving through systems designed not to serve everyone, but to serve something. Profit, efficiency, growth, control. Not inherently bad goals, but not inherently just either. And so the question remains. The question the VOC never asked. The question we now must ask. Because no one else will. If capital holds the power that once belonged to kings, who holds capital accountable? Who decides the direction of invisible ships? Who bears the cost of optimized margins? Who disappears when the system becomes too efficient to see? Who governs when the governors are not people but protocols? And perhaps more importantly, who will be remembered? The ones who ran the machine, or the ones who lived inside it? History is not just about what we remember. It's about what we choose to see and what we choose to question. Because even now, in this moment, there are ships crossing oceans. They carry no flags. They follow no king, but they are shaping the future, one quiet decision at a time. If you're enjoying stories like this, quiet, thoughtful, and rich with history, consider subscribing to History to Sleep. There's a lot more to uncover, and I'd love to have you along for the journey.